Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Dan Link, University Archivist and Deputy Head for Special Collections at the Princeton University Library. I am pleased and honored to serve as moderator for today's talk and to welcome our guests. Today, we are going to be speaking with Peter Baker and Susan Glasser about their book, The Man Who Ran Washington, The Life and Times of James A. Baker III. Peter serves as chief White House correspondent for the New York Times, while Susan Glasser writes for the New Yorker. Both appear regularly on TV news as political analysts. Together, they've written the first biography of James Baker, a distinguished public servant and a member of Princeton's great class of 1952. From the mid-1970s until 1993, Baker was a significant force in American politics. He ran the Reagan White House as chief of staff in Reagan's first term and was Treasury Secretary during his second. In 1988, he ran the presidential campaign of his longtime friend and doubles partner, George H.W. Bush, then became President Bush's Secretary of State. During his tenure there, the Soviet Union crumbles, Germany is reunited, and the First War with Iraq occurs. To write their book, the authors relied on the James A. Baker papers held by Princeton University Library's Special Collections Mudd Library. Totaling more than 300 boxes, Baker's papers give a glimpse into his thinking through letters, memos, and the handwritten notes scrawled on those documents. And full disclosure, I've worked in the Mudd Library for a long time, and over 2 decades ago, as the then assistant archivist, I oversaw the delivery and processing of the Baker papers when Secretary Baker donated them in 2002. Today's talk will last 1 hour, and it will include a question and answer session. You can submit questions throughout the talk using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. We will take the last question as we approach 2:30. So Susan and Peter, thank you for joining us today. Good to see you both again, even remotely.
Thank you, Dan. It's so great to see you. We wish we were there doing it in person.
So if you're ready, let's jump in. So Baker wrote his own memoirs as Secretary of State, a thick book, and then another autobiography. And together it's about 900 pages between them. What will we get out of your book that we don't already have from those? And what significant differences might one find between his account and yours?
Well, it's shorter, first of all. Ours is the shorter version, so you don't have to go through all 900 pages and you get a big picture look at his life. Look, one of the things, of course, that historical figures do when they write their memoirs is they're writing for history. They're trying to make their argument to posterity for how they should be looked at. That's not necessarily the same thing as how their lives really always played out. They don't necessarily include their critics' point of view, or they don't necessarily include certain information that might be seen as less flattering. In fact, one of the great things about coming to Mudd and going through these papers was getting the chance to see what Baker included and what he didn't include. And so when Dan was so generous with us every day we came up there, was always there to welcome us and to help us out and to make sure we had everything we needed. And one of the great things that Dan did was give us a tip at the very beginning. He says, because there were 300 boxes, as he said, it's a lot to go through. What do you start with? Chief of Staff, Treasury. He says, start with Baker's own memoirs and the boxes of material there. Because first of all, it means Baker collected all the material about his own life, first of all, to write the books. And second of all, you might see what he left out. And boy, that's exactly true. One of the best things we found were these memos that he had back and forth with his speechwriters and aides, debating about things that had been taken out of his memoirs because they weren't, what he wanted to emphasize. And so you got a real sense from that of how somebody like a Baker wants to frame himself for history and the parts that he doesn't want everybody to know. So we, of course, include the parts that he didn't want to include his own memoir. And that's one reason you should read our book.
Absolutely.
So there's a saying that journalism is the first draft of history. And though you both have written other books, am I correct? This is the first book you wrote about someone or something that you did not cover as a journalist?
That is a good point, actually. The book that we did, Peter and I did together, Kremlin Rising, was about the rise of Vladimir Putin and sort of the end of the post-Soviet revolution, if you will, the experiment in democracy. And that was something that we covered on the ground in Moscow for 4 years, and then took the time to reflect on. And impeachment was the subject of Peter's first book. That's how we met each other, actually working together at the Washington Post. We like to say this marriage is the only good thing that came out of the Monica Lewinsky saga. Yeah, I think that's a real insight. We were, we are children of the 1989 generation, right? We were around for it. This was the beginning of our young adulthood. I was a senior in college when the Berlin Wall fell. So we remembered these events, but we didn't cover them.
So how did you two get interested in James Baker and ultimately decide to spend all the time to write a book about it?
Well, one thing was we were stunned to learn that nobody had ever done it. As you point out, he is Secretary of State at a really tumultuous and momentous time in our history. That by itself, you would think, would merit a book. Plenty of Secretaries of State have had biographies written about them, and they didn't do very much at all. And Baker was there when the world changed and helped change the world. So that by itself would be enough. But then you add to it the fact that he ran 5 presidential campaigns, as well as Reagan's White House and Treasury Secretary. So you think about it, like Karl Rove and Henry Kissinger rolled into one. That makes for a fascinating story. And then on top of that, I think is his own personal history in Houston, his friendship with George Bush. There was so much there. And the larger question, of course, of how Washington has changed since his time. So it's a story in some ways about this individual, but also a story about ourselves, about Washington and American politics over this last couple generations.
Great, good. So I'm curious, in writing this book together, how did you work? Did you divide up areas of responsibility or research in any way? Did Susan cover foreign policy and Peter domestic, or how did that play out?
Well, the good news is we're still talking and still married, so it is possible to write a book with your spouse. And of course, as I mentioned, we wrote Kremlin Rising together, so we had some sense of how to do it, although that book was a very different book, and we did have a different process because that grew out of our 4 years as foreign correspondents in Moscow. We essentially just, divided it up and also tried to synchronize it with our journalism for the Washington Post. This is one character. This is a biography of someone. So, it really is different. Also, it took place. We ended up working on the book for 7 years, which was not necessarily intended. We began this project back in the dim mists of the Obama era, and obviously the rise of Donald Trump becomes sort of this interesting sort of parallel story about the modern Republican Party and what it's become. And our conversations with Baker, certainly were not what we intended to have a present day framing around the book, but that was a sort of inescapable fact of how the biography was done. But really, Peter, I must say, is the best professional as well as personal partner, and he works all the time and needs much less sleep than I do. So he did all the heavy lifting. That's
not true. That's not true at all. This would have not been a good book at all if Susan weren't working on it together with us. But we do like having this partnership. Our partnership, because as Susan mentioned, began in the Washington Post newsroom. So we've always been professional as well as personal partners, which is a great tandem. And in fact, she mentioned the book, Kremlin Rising. That was so much harder than this one because in fact, she was pregnant when we wrote that book. So we literally turned in the last 2 chapters and she says, oh, good, because I'm having contractions. And we had the baby the same day we turned in that book. So this book was easy by comparison. No baby, no pregnancy. We just had 7 years to work on it.
Okay, so this next question is about your professional, not your personal life. But are there any places that you differed on how to cover something in the book? And can you tell us about the debate and who fell where and how you worked it out?
I'm not sure we really did.
It's so interesting. Honestly, I feel like we had more arguments over Days of Fire, which I did not co-write with Peter. Although I certainly, tried to help with the framing of that. That was a hard book to figure out how to frame. And whereas, we had an editor, a colleague at the Washington Post, who is now the dean of the Columbia Journalism School, Steve Call, a wonderful journalist and writer of great books. And he had the saying, chronology is your friend. Well, in a biography, right, you don't have to worry that much about structure. And I do think that structure is the hardest part of a lot of big projects. And so, in that sense,
I think I'm trying to think.
We struggled over what to do about the Trump thing. I mean, honestly, but not with each other per se. We really did struggle to how do we grapple with, this incredible
Right.
disruptive moment and Baker's own extreme discomfort with Trump and the hostile takeover of the Republican Party, and yet his unwillingness to renounce Trump fully,
Right.
unlike the Bushes. And, that's become a lot of the news that people have asked us about on the book tour. And we really struggled with that in a way that it's interesting to see our audience now struggling with that, so in a way it's actually been kind of a relief to me, like, because we're, putting this out there for the rest of the world to also try to accommodate, here's this figure who emerges over decades in the papers at Princeton and in his life as sort of the un-Trump, right? Like a model of, sort of discipline and, believer in hard work and, and a certain sense of American leadership in the world and integrity, which meant everything to him. His motto in dealing with journalists is never lie to the press. And then how do you make sense of this incredible moment? So that was the hard part for us, I think.
I don't think we had any other, I mean, like trying to think, like we discussed how much we wanted to devote to his post, office period, like how interesting was it after he leaves Secretary of State? And there actually turned out to be a lot of things that were kind of interesting about that. The Florida recount, obviously the Iraq study groups and things. We did debated back and forth about the title. Susan came up with the title, which is great, but it was originally going to be The Man Who Ran Washington When Washington Ran the World, which we also liked, but it was too long for the cover. I think we kind of.
We didn't disagree over that.
No, we didn't disagree, but you came up with it, and I had some other ideas that weren't as good. I think the cover, maybe we had some slight disagreement on the cover. We were debating which one would be better. I don't know. I think broadly speaking, these are small things, and the good thing is, and this is what made it such a fun project to work on, is that the rest of it just kind of fell into place. I think we had a complete identical sense of the larger framing and how to structure it and how the chapters would play out. And we never had any disagreement about that stuff.
No.
Okay, great. So some biographers get captured by their subject, and that's actually one of the themes of your book, in the sense that Baker was famous for how well he managed relations with the media. And you interviewed him, I think, more than 70 times, and several places in your book, you noticed that if you didn't call him charismatic per se, you at least noted that he was persuasive and personally attractive, especially when he was lobbying people. So how did you manage around this?
Yeah, I think we went into it knowing, of course, how his reputation for being really good at working reporters. And we went in, therefore, with our eyes open, and our heads up, I think, in that sense. We were surprised, though, because I think that while, obviously he's super good at, managing his own reputation and carefully cultivating reporters, with us, we felt like he really lived up to his part of the bargain. His part of the bargain was he was going to open everything up to us. He opened up your archives to us completely without having to go through some of the restrictions that other people had to go through. He opened up archives at the time. It's now open to everybody, I believe. He opened up his archives at Rice University. He gave us papers. Every member of his family we wanted to talk to agreed to talk to us. And he gave us as many interviews, as much time as we ever asked for. And he never tried to put anything off the record. He never tried to say, no, you shouldn't write about this, including painful stuff about his family. I thought he was very open with us. So we were always on guard against being spun, obviously, but he was very straight with us. I think he had a time of his life where he's comfortable with himself, he's comfortable with his story, and he's comfortable that even the things that are the warts, as he calls them, in the end will be put in perspective.
Yeah, I do think that, as journalists who live in a world where it's, especially the real-time world of politics, where not only are you literally confronting sort of a blizzard of untruths, from the White House, but you're also just even the more run-of-the-mill back and forth with people is subject to an enormous amount of real-time spin and, sort of litigating even over minor matters. And, we, as Peter said to another person the other day, like, we've been yelled at by the best of them, Democratic White Houses as well as Republican. And so I do think that's where this being a more of a historical project, even though the subject was around, and having access to the archives and, real-time memos and papers in addition to his own memories was very valuable. Baker was a super cooperative subject, but he has told his story many times. And so, I don't know, like, I think Peter and I, one probably the biggest value of those interviews from my perspective was not some great revelation per se that he offered us, but more this chance to experience Baker and his personality and what he was like and how he thought about things. Because as you said, we didn't cover that in real time. So we had this access to our subject that I think made us able to give a better portrait of the man. But the his days of offering revelatory new information in a sit-down interview are probably past, in the sense that he's told his stories. His stories are what they are.
Right. Well, with that said, how would you compare him with other chiefs of staff and other secretaries of state? And you can consider that a two-part question.
Well, he's considered basically to be the gold standard of chiefs of staff. We hear from Democrats and Republicans alike that when they try to put together their White House, they try to model it in some ways on the way Baker ran it. I mean, every Democrat and every Republican chief of staff since he was in office called and consulted with Baker, I think, to get their, get his secret sauce, if you will. And even in March of this year, when President Trump named Mark Meadows as his latest, I think, fourth or fifth, I've lost track, of chief of staff, he said to some supporters, I want him to be my Jim Baker. This was somebody, so he is seen as the gold standard in that sense, because he understood politics, he understood the media, he understood his moment. I think as Secretary of State, is a fascinating contrast, because in a way he's a fixer as a chief of staff for another president, but as Secretary of State, he gets to be a statesman. He gets to be a principal. He gets to be a major figure himself. And his relationship with President Bush is so strong that he's almost an equivalent, a shadow president, if you will. Aaron David Miller, is one of his aides, told us when he landed in a foreign capital, it was as if the president was landing, because everybody knew that Baker spoke for Bush. So those are two unique circumstances that it's hard to see any other Secretary of State or Chief of Staff matching in the immediate future.
So you mentioned the secret sauce of when he was Chief of Staff. What do you think comprised that secret sauce?
Well, I have to say that is, versions of this question are, of course, the question that every single person, especially in Washington, has asked us over the last 7 years on learning of this project, because Baker is seen as uniquely effective at running the White House. And so people are wanting to understand what it is. If you ask Baker, he gives you a sort of song and dance that's very practiced at this point about the 5 Ps. Ask his kids, they'll roll their eyes. Prior preparation prevents poor performance. Even our son can, spiel this off. Look, Washington is obviously filled with workaholic lawyers, who read the briefing book and, are prepared. Now, it does seem that hyper competence and organization were clearly a part of Baker's secret sauce, and by the way, sorely in absence. And you feel it when it's not there, as we can all attest to by merely living through 2020. So I'm not to downgrade uber competence as a part of one's secret sauce, but it's not, I would say, that original per se. The story of how Baker acquired power in the Reagan White House, I think, tells you more about what he understood to be the levers of power, not just in that Reagan White House, but in any White House. Baker, an outsider to the Reagan inner circle, run 2 national campaigns against Ronald Reagan, both Jerry Ford's and George H.W. Bush's in the primary, nonetheless is brought in by one faction of the Reaganistas. Reagan goes along with it, but he's still an outsider. And the first assignment he has is given by Ronald Reagan essentially is to placate your defeated rival, Ed Meese. Reagan was famously, conflict averse. And so it's left to Baker to sit down with Ed Meese and to figure out a power sharing agreement in this White House, while Meese is furious at not having been given the chief of staff job. So Baker famously, essentially treats this as a lawyer and a negotiation, and he, has a paper with their assignments and roles on each side. He hands to Meese the big victory, in quotes here, of having the fancy title and cabinet level status, and Henry Kissinger's former office, and Meese and being on the National Security Council, and Meese, takes these as victories. Meanwhile, Baker says in my column, well, I'll just deal with, the less sexy functions, like, the legislative affairs and the press office and the personnel, and of course the paper flow, to and from the president's office and the staff secretary's job. Well, of course, that is the power in any White House, and he's just rolled Ed Meese completely. And my favorite part of the story is that so he makes them both initial it, and he's already essentially won. But Meese actually digs his own grave even further by his last minute addition to the list. And he says to Baker, well, I just have one more thing before we sign off on this. I've been thinking about it, and I would like to have the right to, go into any meeting with the president since I'm his counselor. And Baker says, oh, that's a great idea. And just, for parallelism's sake, I'll put that down in my column too. And so at the last minute, Meese has just signed away the right to have a private meeting with Ronald Reagan, because now he's just agreed that Jim Baker can go into any meeting, including his own meetings. So I love that story. And I do think it tells you a lot about the secret sauce.
Well, another of the themes of your book you've sort of touched on in your answer is that Baker was not known as being particularly ideological. I mean, he starts off as a Democrat. And you emphasize, and rightfully so, his pragmatism. Yet his ability to get things done served perhaps the most ideological president, at least in our lifetimes, Ronald Reagan. So can you say more about the positives and negatives of that?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. Like he is a conservative, small c, but he doesn't stand on ideology, he doesn't stand on ceremony. He's willing to trade things away to get things done. And his point was always that Reagan is more of a pragmatist than people give him credit for too. That Reagan is the one who empowered him to do that. Reagan is the one who told him over and over again, I'd rather get 80% of what I want than fly my flag going over the cliff, trying to get something I'm not going to get. But Baker was then left to be the lightning rod among conservatives who were upset that Reagan wasn't getting more, trying for things that happen. And that was fine. That was part of Baker's job. The let Reagan be let Reagan chant of the 1980s from the Reaganistas, from the hardcore conservatives, was a jab at Baker. But in a way, it was also a jab at Reagan. And Baker took the heat for him by being the pragmatist. But it made a difference because, look, Reagan had a Democratic House for all 8 years he was president. He wasn't going to get stuff done unless he worked with the Democrats. So Baker says, okay, he promised to eliminate the Department of Education during the campaign, but let's face it, that ain't going to happen. So let's put that to the side. Tax cuts, that could happen. Spending cuts, that could happen. Increased defense spending, that could happen. So he sits down with Democrats and cuts deals. And that's what Reagan wants, to be honest. People, again, want to pretend that was done in opposition to Reagan. It was done with Reagan's not only approval, but that's what Reagan, in a sense, sent him off to do.
Right. Was there anything that you think Baker was ideological about?
That is a good question. I mean, if you talk to him now, right, you see, and especially in a person in their 80s or 90, what's their essence? What are their core beliefs distilled down to, right, outside of the combat of the day? And, it's very clear to me that his belief in a sort of, kind of late Cold War era notion of American leadership remains very strong. Not, by the way, the sort of militarized post 9/11 version of American leadership, but he is really at his core an internationalist in a sort of very late 20th century way, right? Like he is a believer in alliances, in multilateralism, not because he's a sort of UN process guy, but he is a true believer that there is such a thing as the West, and that America has a seat at the head of the table of it, and that it's only successful when it works in concert, intensive concert with others, which of course is a key takeaway, not just from the end of the Cold War, but even of the period leading up to it. He's not a unilateralist in any way. He's a fervent internationalist in a very old-fashioned, I would say, Republican Party way. He is a free trader. He's a conservative in terms of budgets and the like. But he's not a culture warrior. And in fact, he really genuinely was on the other side of many of the Reaganistas when it came to that, not because he wasn't religious. He is, in fact, privately very religious, for example, but he clearly did not believe that was a conversation that belonged in the public space. And I think, for example, of one early fight in the Reagan era when there was a Supreme Court opening. And it was Baker who pushed for Sandra Day O'Connor and actually literally physically blocked the conservatives who wanted and were suspicious of O'Connor and correctly and presciently understood that she wasn't going to be a reliable vote for them on the court. He would not let them meet with Ronald Reagan to air their concerns about that. And to me, that's an example of like where him being in that position, he wasn't just a technocrat, you know, kind of moving pieces of paper around and doing the bidding of others, but that's an example of where who is there in a position of power like that actually makes a difference. And, you know, O'Connor made a difference, you know, for several decades.
I think one thing that came out in your book for me was how much he was opposed to military action by others in the administration. That I don't want to say he was a non-interventionist or anti-war, but he definitely, you brought out strains of his opposition to military action in Latin America that I don't think has generally been reported on before.
Yeah, I think that's right. Exactly. You know, by the way, in addition to the archives and these papers that are there at MUD, there's also the Princeton Oral History Project on James Baker, which is a fabulous resource for anybody who's thinking about doing their own research about him or this time. And you guys have done a fabulous job with that. Thank you very much for that. And we found in one of those oral histories a description by Michael Deaver, who of course was the deputy chief of staff and Reagan's sort of image man. And he describes Baker sitting down with him early in the Reagan White House saying, we were sitting so closely, we were almost touching knees to knees. And Baker says, our job, your job and my job is to prevent these crazy people from getting us into a war in Central America. And so he saw from the very beginning where there was this proxy fight with the Soviets in Nicaragua and El Salvador, that was a danger spot for the Reagan administration. And he saw that as a place that they should try to avoid adventurism. And that it worked more or less for the 4 years that he was in charge. They funded the Contras, but kept the Americans out for the most part. And only the second term, when Baker was gone and the Treasury Department and not part of it, did suddenly Iran-Contra happen. So you can see what would have happened had he been there. So I think that's a good example of what you're talking about.
Yeah. Another theme of your book is the extraordinary friendship he had with George H.W. Bush. How would you describe it, and how did their friendship impact history?
Well, it really, what's fascinating about that story, and you're right, that's at the center of this book, is arguably neither man would have ended up, you know, in the history books potentially without the other. And that I think makes it unique, you know, that it wasn't always an exactly equal two-way deal, but over time, eventually it was, in the sense that their stories are interdependent on each other. It's certainly true that Jim Baker never would have been in Washington probably at all if it were not for George H.W. Bush. And, you know, I do think the power dynamic shifted pretty radically over time in that relationship. Initially, Baker told us he was almost even dazzled, was the word that he used, by George Bush. It's hard to remember now, knowing so much else about Bush. But, you know, when Baker first encountered him, you know, Bush was a charismatic figure. He was a war hero from World War II, whereas Baker was younger during the war and only served in the Marines after World War II was over. Bush had been a naval aviator. He had also broken away in a certain sense from the demands of his, you know, sort of very rigorous family. His father, Prescott Bush, was a senator from Connecticut at that time, but Bush had gone to, you know, Texas to make his own fortune. He then shows up in Houston, which is where he and Baker meet, and becomes a member of Congress. And for Baker, this was really, you know, I think a little bit, you know, outside of his very constrained world of great privilege, but also great duty and responsibility. It was a constrained and narrow world, I think, that Baker's Houston of family obligation. And, you know, he dealt with that, you know, by hunting and, you know, drinking and playing tennis, you know, and not really being engaged. But Bush suggested a different way. And then when Baker has the tragic death of his first wife, Mary Stewart, you know, probably the biggest insight into the Bush-Baker relationship for me was seeing for the first time this letter that Baker wrote to George Bush, in which he confesses that his wife has been given this fatal cancer diagnosis. And he says, George, I have told no one about this, not Mary Stewart herself, not my mother, not my children, but I'm telling you. And so that for me answered a key question that we started out the book with, which was what was the real nature of their relationship, right? You know, like over time, right? A relationship like this could grow in the telling, right? And, you know, maybe it really was just sort of drinks at the country club and, you know, kind of doubles on the weekends. But I don't think that's the case. And for me, that letter was really powerful. And actually, it was George and Barbara Bush who were the last two people outside of the family to see Mary Stuart alive in the hospital.
Yeah, yeah. So for the 100 or so viewers of this, I just want to say that the pages in which you recount Mary Stuart's cancer and ultimate death and the letter she leaves for Baker after he passes is one of the most touching things I've ever read in a book on political history. And I recommend the book just for that alone, although there are many other good qualities of it. So how did Baker's pragmatism serve him under President Bush?
Well, look, you know, the world changes on their watch, right? It's not that Bush or Baker make the wall fall down in Berlin. It's not that Bush or Baker make the Soviet Union collapse. But what they do is try to harness these great forces of history that are blowing through Europe and the world at this time. And it's their pragmatism that helps them bring what could be a very tumultuous and volatile moment in our history to a safe landing, in effect. And Baker's pragmatism is, you know, okay, the Germans are now suddenly looking like they want to reunify. We're going to jump ahead of that parade and try to figure out how to lead it to the right place. The Germans were moving faster than the Americans were at first. And just to use this as an example, Baker says, okay, how do we create a process that will make this happen in a smooth way that makes everybody more or less happy? Because not everybody liked the idea of reunified Germany, not just the Soviets who were pretty against it, but the British and the French who had fought 2 wars against Germany, right? Yeah. And then on top of that, you got not like 2 Germanys to negotiate with. If you're Baker, you're negotiating with 2 different parties within West Germany because the chancellor was of one party and the foreign minister was from another. And so he comes up with his staff with this process they call the 2+4. Now it sounds very wonky, but what that means is let the Germans do the main negotiation. It's their country, and the 4 victorious World War II powers, Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States, will be the secondary players guaranteeing what they come up with. It sounds very processy, but in fact, that's the way to bring everybody to the table and came up with a deal more or less that everybody could live with. And had they not done it in the record land speed that he did it in, it's very possible it wouldn't have happened, or at least not have happened as smoothly as it did, because very quickly Iraq invades Kuwait. The Soviet hardliners are trying to mount a coup against Gorbachev, and the world is changing even further.
So if you had to write Baker's epitaph in the same way that Jefferson wrote his own, listing only 3 things he wanted to be remembered for, what would you say? And how would that maybe differ from Baker's list?
That's a great list. That's a great question. Yeah.
I mean, look, he wants to be remembered as a statesman. You know, he does. And that was one of the interesting things, the tension, very palpable tension, you know, between being brilliant at being a political handler and, you know, a label he hated. And yet that's what he was great at. And wanting to be, you know, some considered in his own right, you know, a statesman and a world figure. You know, in my view, what he was actually was a brilliant, the most brilliant, you know, political strategist of his time. It's just that, you know, politics in the biggest sense of the word, right? You know, whether it was national campaign politics or ultimately international diplomacy is a form of politics married to negotiating. And he happened to be really great at both of those things. You know, you could call him, you know, Jim Baker deal maker, you know, as in the real deal. I think, you know, exactly. You definitely, in some ways, that's the essence of the man. You know, I'll tell you a little story because I think, again, it shows you what he is still, you know, in his 80s, in a way is sort of like his core attributes. A few years ago, the Episcopal Church was in an uproar in the South over the issue of recognizing same-sex marriages, and many of the Southern Episcopal churches were breaking away. Well, the head of the Texas Episcopal Church came to Baker and said, I don't want that to happen to us. Can you help me? And, true to form, again, he's, at this point, what, like 80, 82 years old? Baker finds a way, essentially he negotiates for more time for the Texas diocese. They still have to recognize the same-sex marriages, but he buys them, a few years to get used to it. And in the end, Texas was the only Southern state where their Episcopal Church did not break away from the National Episcopal Church. And to me, I love that story because it shows that pragmatism is the essence of the man, even outside of the political clashes of the 1980s, right? And also deal making. He found a creative way to do things that others could not, that others found too difficult to accomplish.
So I want to encourage our viewers to put their questions into the Q&A box below as we'll start taking those in a moment. But my last formal question, I know you've been doing a lot of these book talks. Is there a question that you've prepared for that no one's asked you yet? So in other words, I'm going to give you a chance to interview yourselves. What's the question? What's the answer?
That's great. That's a question we've never had before. That's a good one right there. And I'm not prepared for it, unfortunately. That's a good one. What is a good question we have?
I mean, there's some good stories in the book that
a lot of good stories in the book.
Don't come up.
Yeah, don't. We wish they would come up. There's so many of them. The great thing about Baker is that almost anything that's happening today in today's politics, there's kind of an antecedent in his life, right? Whether, as Susan says, as a Supreme Court nomination, well, he was involved with a pretty important one, and the contrast between the move to the middle then versus the move to the right now is interesting.
The interest rates thing.
Oh yeah,
pressuring the chairman of the
he
Fed.
pressures the chairman of the Federal Reserve rate not to raise interest rates during an election. He almost orders them basically, which is something that's considered not to be allowed.
And
basically.
tries to stack the Fed.
Our
economics wonk friend who read this was literally texting us like, oh my God, I can't believe this.
Yeah.
But that one has never come up.
Yeah, it doesn't come up.
Yeah.
It is in Volker's book.
Yeah,
well,
it
is
is.
in Volker's
That's
book,
right.
and most people
About it.
didn't notice it. You're exactly right.
And there's a little bit also in Rick Smith's book great book about Washington, the power game, about the stacking of the Fed and Baker's, intrigues there, but nobody really put it together, I think.
Yeah, there's so many things. We'll have to think about the question that we didn't want to be asked. Come back to that, I think.
No, I was just assuming there's so much to talk about Baker that maybe you prepared for something about, the Madrid Peace Conference, which in itself is worth, a discussion and a question, but we didn't get to it.
Yeah, that's one of the ones that often gets left to the side, which is a shame because, in fact, in some ways, it's really interesting. And for your students and anybody else who's watching who might not remember, it's the first time the Israelis ever sat down with their neighbors, but Baker brings them together after the Gulf War. And the thing that's, if you asked, one question that we often get is, what is his biggest regret? I would say his biggest regret is not getting a chance to have a second term where he could have taken that opening conference and built something more lasting there. And we're still seeing the consequences of that today. If he had been able to do something, maybe we wouldn't be in the same stalemate that the Middle East is now.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. And I think we're ready to take questions now. And I'm looking in the chat box. So first question, since you've spent a lot of time with Baker, how do you feel about him personally? What was he like to be with?
So, I mean, this was the part that I think was incredibly valuable to Peter and I in Baker's generosity and spending time with us, because we had not covered him, when he was at his prime in Washington and we were just, young students or starting out. He is an engaging, charismatic figure. A lot of people described him to us, and correctly, as it turned out, as somebody who's one of his gifts is the ability to interact with people across lines and with very different identities, even though he's a child of privilege of Houston and Princeton and the Hill School. He had this sort of shape-shifting ability that I think was really noticeable with us. And he read people as well. Jim Baker is an outdoors man. He loves, and from a young age, he's a hunter. Although I think we came away feeling that he was fundamentally driven by, not so much killing stuff as wanting to be outside. And we went to his ranch.
He does kill stuff.
Yeah, no, he likes that. In fact, he got the coronavirus earlier this year at the age of 90, along with his wife, Susan. And they had a pretty tough case of it. He described, being flat out on his back and not even being able to get out of bed for 5 or 6 days. Well, when he recovered, what he did within weeks, literally, was to go to his ranch in Wyoming and go elk hunting. So again, at age 90, that tells you a lot about the guy. We saw him at that ranch, which was probably the most memorable time that we spent with him and his wife. And again, for a person of great privilege, I'll tell you this, that ranch is not a fancy, like, rich person's ranch in Architectural Digest, Jackson Hole Ranch. It's 2 hours outside of Jackson Hole, on a remote homesteader's old property. In fact, he and his wife Susan live in the old fixed up homesteader's cabin. And they built sort of a big bunkhouse up the hill for the family and for visitors. That's very nice, but not the height of luxury. All the power on this ranch is off of a generator, and he and his wife argue at night over when they can turn it off. So to me, that tells you a lot about the guy.
Right, right. Another question I think is a good one. What did Baker know about Reagan's cognitive decline, and how did he handle this?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. We've asked him that, and he would say he didn't notice. Reagan, of course, had Alzheimer's after leaving office, and the question has often been, did that mean he might have been affected during his latter years? And I think most people would say that he slowed down clearly in his last 2 years, but they don't necessarily know that that was because of Alzheimer's or that he had a genuine, genuine issues. In fact, Howard Baker, who was one of Jim Baker's successors as chief of staff, when he arrived at the White House, was told that Reagan was slipping and assigned his team to observe Reagan and prepare for the possibility that they might have to invoke the 25th Amendment of disability, where you transfer power to the vice president. And after they observed him for a while, they realized, no, he's an older man. Obviously, he's not as fast as he once was, but he was still there. And I think that's what Baker would say. Yeah, or Jim Baker, that is, as opposed to Howard Baker.
Yeah. And at this point, we should just say Howard Baker, Peter Baker, James Baker, no relation among the three of you.
No relation among the three. That's right.
So I have to ask a local question that someone brings up. Did you ever speak with Baker about how his time, connections, or experiences at Princeton impacted his career?
Absolutely, we did. And it was very interesting. So Baker, there was already a family tradition. We've mentioned a few times, but we haven't really explained. Like, for those who don't know, Baker was the son, grandson, and great-grandson of Houston lawyers who were more than lawyers, who were really, institution builders, city builders, if you will. His great-grandfather had been a friend of Sam Houston's and had immigrated from Huntsville, Alabama to Huntsville, Texas. And had then gone on to become one of the founders of the Baker Botts law firm, which to this day is a big, powerful law firm. At one time, it was the largest law firm west of the Mississippi. In particular, his grandfather, a man known as Captain Baker, was essentially, truly one of the creators of the modern city of Houston, founder of Rice University. Every institution that shaped our Jim Baker, his grandfather had a hand in. They founded all the, both Houston country clubs, the private school he went to, the banks that they all sat on the board of. His wife founded the Houston Art Museum. I mean, it literally, that's the kind of family it was. They had a family motto: work hard, study, stay out of politics. So, his father had gone to Princeton before him and actually been in the sort of pre-World War I era, a big man on campus, as far as I can tell. And captain of this and that, really shaped by his time at. He went on to become a war hero in World War I, like a genuine war hero who was in the trenches for something like, was it 5 straight weeks? I mean, some insane amount of time that he was in the trenches in World War I. So Baker is forced to go both to the Hill School, this prep school that his family went to by his father, and then his father insists he goes to Princeton. His dad was a huge micromanager. Baker and his friends called him the warden growing up, which gives you a big sense of, what kind of a dad he was. Baker was a terrible student. really, or a mediocre student for someone who was so bright. And his father was worried he wasn't going to get into Princeton, and actually starts writing to Princeton a year before he's going to apply, essentially sort of saying like, well, my boy Jimmy, you got to let him in, and he's not the best student, but and
Yeah. Yeah, so, but once he arrives there, Princeton is an awakening for him.
Right. He lets loose.
He lets loose. He says himself, he says, I went kind of crazy when I went to Princeton, because suddenly he no longer had the father leaning over and that Susan describes, and he joins a group called the Right Wing Club. Now, this is not a political club. This is a right wing club. They call it the Right Wing because it takes your right wing to get your beer to your mouth. That was what he was doing at Princeton. He played tennis for a couple of years, but then he gave that up. And played rugby there. He was he was one of the Texans on campus. This is Princeton, as you know, probably in that era was seen as the Ivy that was friendliest to the Southern applicants who were going to come there. So they did have other Texans there, but it was an awakening for him to meet people from the East Coast. He talks about going into New York for parties and meeting people who were really upper crust and learning the whole debutante society of the East, which he didn't really have any familiarity with in Houston. He writes home to his parents, I'm glad just to be among us upper middies, meaning upper middles.
Class. Yeah, no, I find that hilarious that a guy of such privilege, clearly felt looked down upon a little bit by the New York society types. Right. But basically he was not a good student. And he kind of let loose. He was partying for the first time in his life outside of the day-to-day supervision of his father.
He made lifelong friends. He had the same three roommates through all 4 years of Princeton, and they were they're lifelong buddies. In fact, it was his friend
very
David
long
Payton.
lived.
They're all still around as far as I know. David Payton was his best man at his wedding. We interviewed all three of his roommates. He wrote home about seeing Albert Einstein and on campus and going to a lecture of his. I mean, he did get a lot out of Princeton, and I think he did shape up academically by the end a little bit, but he was not.
Tell the story though.
Oh yeah, this is a crazy story.
He is crazy. I mean, he was like really.
He tells a story,
crazy.
Which is what's wild about it. So he's so crazy in his freshman year that one of his fellow students says, I'm in trouble. There's this test tomorrow. I can't possibly take it. I need you to break my fingers so I won't have to take the test, right? And all the other kids in the dorm or wherever they are say, well, no, we can't do that. That's kind of crazy. Baker says, I'll do it. And he takes a switch and he whacks it across the guy's hand. He breaks his fingers. And so that says a little bit about his kind of wild days.
Perhaps it tells you something about Princeton in this era.
Well, we don't want to discourage. We don't want to encourage anybody else there to take, do as he says, not as he did.
Right. So this next question touches a bit on the foreword of your book, which is, given how President Trump has acted in regards to the Bush family, were you surprised that Baker refused to totally reject Trump?
Short answer, yes.
Yeah.
Slightly longer answer. Look, this was one of the, it became an interesting and sort of complicated backdrop to this biographical project, right? Was to see what was happening to the Republican Party in real time and how Baker responded to that. And look, I mean, on some level, it's sort of unfair, right? He's a guy who was in his late 80s as this was happening, and more or less still working, but step back from public life. He's not responsible for the politics of his age, but nonetheless, it was fascinating for us, and we kept asking him the question over and over again, right, throughout this period of time. And we're surprised in the end, perhaps, by the consistency of Baker's answer. The Bush thing offered him an easy way out. Usually, right, in politics and in life, people take the easy way out. Well, I'm not going to support Donald Trump because look at what he said about my good friend, George Bush and his sons, right? That's the easy way out. The fact that he didn't take it, I think Peter and I came to think that, number one, it told us something about his attitude toward power, which is to say, if you're on the outside, pissing at it, you really don't have any. And that in order, you have to preserve your access and being inside the tent, leaving aside the question of what he needed that for at this point in time. I do think it told us something about his views about power. And then it ultimately tells, especially this year in 2020, it probably tells us something about how he is asking to be remembered, right? He said the last conversation about this election with him was one that Peter had. And right before that, we had met him for lunch. I guess it was in the summer of 2019 in Washington. And he had volunteered to us, well, I'm considering voting for Joe Biden if he becomes the nominee. He's my kind of Democrat, more or less, and I like him and he's a good man. And we hadn't even asked him, so that was interesting. But then a couple months later, Peter saw him in Texas, and Baker said, no, don't say I'm going to vote for Biden. I'm a Republican, even if my party has left me. And so it seemed to me that that was a very conscious statement on his part, that he, people will reduce that and say, well, he's choosing party over country. I don't know if that's the answer, but he certainly is choosing a partisan identity and the idea that he wants to be remembered as a Republican who built whatever it is that this current Republican Party stands for. That's Ellie the dog, sorry.
I've been waiting for mine to bark. She hasn't. I'm going to read this next question exactly as it's written. Could you talk briefly about Baker's view of the career Foreign Service, aka deep state, these days, alas?
Yeah. Well, it's a great question, actually. And there's one we hadn't gotten a lot of, but I don't know if Baker views him as a deep state, but there was no question that there was some friction or some distance between him and the career Foreign Service. If you go through the oral histories collected by the American Diplomacy Association of old ambassadors and diplomats from his era, there is this sense by them that Baker didn't have much time for them, right? He comes to the State Department with what they call the plug-in unit. The plug-in unit were the people that he surrounded himself with who he really trusted, people he really depended on. Bob Zellick, Margaret Tutwiler, Janet Mullins, in this case, Dennis Ross, Bob Kimmett. And so, there was this sense of, well, he just wants to be with his people and not with us. But I think that kind of moderated at least a little bit over time, because he did bring in some of the career service people who he thought were really very helpful and useful to him. And I think that career people ultimately, at least some, came to the idea that, look, under Baker, at least, the State Department is where the action is. We can have a lot of secretaries of state who are just sort of drifting off on their own, who don't really have much relevance. This is a guy who's playing on all the big topics of the era, and that means that we, the State Department, are as well. So there was kind of a complicated, mixed relationship there.
Yeah.
I think one difference that I would point out from this sort of turbocharged rhetoric of today was that, Baker and Bush did not view the executive branch, needless to say, as enemies within, or quite the opposite. They understood that this was, in fact, the tools in their arsenal. They might have differed over the best and most effective way to do things compared with the career Foreign Service. But Baker definitely also saw himself as an institutional advocate. He is by nature a diplomat. And believe me, in those internecine warfare with the Pentagon, he was team state all the way. But that's different. That kind of infighting and bureaucracy exists, in all governments, Democratic and Republican. I think what we're seeing right now that is truly different is the idea of the presidency and the White House making war on what they have now classified as enemies within. That's not something that either Jim Baker or George Herbert Walker Bush even entertained.
Well, I think we have time for one more question, and it's a good one to conclude on. Is Baker's type of politics gone forever, or can it be restored?
That's a great question. And we've struggled with that, in fact, over the 7 years of this book, because we started in 2013 before Trump came along and felt even then that Washington was so dysfunctional that there was a contrast between his Washington and the Washington that we had come to know. And you're right. I think that Baker, to some extent, is successful because the marriage of man and moment. I mean, his skill set was suited to the moment and the opportunities that presented themselves to him. And today, the incentive structure has changed. Back then, there was a sense of reward if you worked across party lines and got things done. You wanted to have somebody from the other party agree with you on something because it meant that you were doing something more sustainable. Today, you would be accused of selling out if you made a deal with the other side, even if it was a favorable deal to your side. Today, the word compromise is considered to be a dirty word rather than a good word. And I think that's a real contrast. Will it always be that way? No, I don't think so. I think American history, as we look at it, is full of cycles. We've gone through moments of great polarization and then kind of pulled back from that. And I think we're in a moment of great polarization, but I don't think it's inevitable that we're always going to be that way. On the other hand, I don't see how it changes in the immediate future, but I think that history is not inevitable.
Well, look, I totally agree with Peter. And I guess just a final thought that I'd leave you with is, look at the coronavirus relief package, and the idea that Democrats and Republicans in an election year have not been able to come together since April and literally actually give Americans money, right? Usually politicians like to give money away.
Easiest thing.
And also there's a broad national consensus on many of these issues. Like we tend to focus on the things where there's a hopeless, non-intersecting conversation, right? Between red America and blue America. What if you reframed it and you had a leader a la a Baker and a president who wanted to reframe it? What if you reframed it and looked at what are the things that 80% of Americans right this very moment agree upon? There's actually a long list of things. And by the way, that included wearing masks until that was politicized. If you go back and look in March and April of this year, 80% of Americans supported that and other public health measures. So that's an example, arguably, where leadership in a positive or negative direction makes a difference. So I don't rule it out, but let's just say that this book is a portrait of not just a man, but also of a moment that is definitively past. And so it will be for others to figure this one out, I'm afraid.
Well, Peter, Susan, thank you so much. And my thanks also to the staff at the Princeton School for Public and International Affairs for all their work behind the scenes to make this happen. And thank you for joining us. And this concludes today's event.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.